many conversations happening in so many different localities. What are the most important ones? Because it feels like the headline is not changing. Israel is about to go into Rafa and Netanyahu is not interested in negotiating with Hamas right now.
Well, I would put that there are three conversations that we should be watching very closely right now. First are the conversations between the Americans and the Israelis. Those are coming on the backdrop of deteriorating relations between the two, and they're getting to a point where the United States might finally put down their diplomatic foot and do a hard stop to Israel's military campaign in Gaza. The second thing we should be tracking are the negotiations in Doha. Those are still happening. They don't have a whole lot of prospect of a breakthrough right now, but there's always an outside chance of a ceasefire or a deal coming from that. And finally, we should be looking for what's going on between Iran, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, where their leadership is currently in Tehran trying to coordinate their potential next steps as this is moving into a new, more sustained, extended violent campaign.
You say the U.S. could put a hard stop to this. How on earth could it do that, Ryan?
Well, the United States has enormous diplomatic and political leverage over Israel, not to say, of course, that most of Israel's military support and arms industry relies completely on the United States. Now, the U.S. is nowhere near that point where it would cut off arms to Israel, but it can certainly, and it already has through its abstention at the UN, shown to Israel that without U.S. support, Israel is diplomatically isolated from virtually the entire international community, which really right now wants to see an improvement in humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip, even if that means giving Hamas some military breathing space. In addition to that, the Netanyahu government is extraordinarily weak right now. It is getting weaker by the day, and the United States can put its fingers on the scales of electoral politics within Israel itself to potentially accelerate the path to new elections.
What would give Netanyahu political cover to not go into Rafah or to put it off for so long that maybe something else happens in the meantime?
Well, the reality is that Netanyahu has a political incentive to draw out the Rafah campaign. As soon as the Rafah campaign is completed, the major combat operations, at least the political phase of that, will come to an end. And the wartime unity government that he needs to stay in power, or provide him a buffer space to stay in power, will more or less dissolve right after that. So he has an incentive to drag it out for as long as he can, so long as his political support within Israel itself allows him to. So we've got that angle there. But there's also the angle that eventually that domestic support could collapse within Israel or start to collapse. And that would incentivize Netanyahu to try to wrap those operations up. And he may choose to still carry out a mass military assault to do so.
You say that Palestinian Islamic Jihad leadership is in Iran right now. What more do we know about what's happening there?
It's very hard to say. We don't believe that Iran is pulling the strings, so to speak, or directing Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. But certainly this coordination involves what Iran would be willing to tolerate in terms of how much longer the conflict could last. It could give them some insight into what Hezbollah's next moves might be. It could also give them some insight into what Iran's plans for Hamas might be in the longer run, because Hamas, once they're deprived of their geography in the Gaza Strip, they could end up being more dependent on Iran, particularly as they reconstitute in places like Lebanon and Syria, which are firmly under Iranian influence.
Do you see Hamas reconstituting as an entity with that name?
I think that they will be an umbrella organization that will survive as Hamas in the long run. But without the core geography of the Gaza Strip over time, it's very likely that internal factions within Hamas will pull it in different directions. It may not fracture to the extent that we have seen with ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which have become regionalized franchises. But without Gaza to provide that kind of geographic anchor, it seems more and more likely that Hamas will be pulled into different franchises or umbrella groups under the influence of whatever geography that they happen to be in.
And then, Ryan, the negotiations that are ongoing in Doha, is it possible that you'll see a breakthrough in those negotiations, even if there's a complete stalemate or even a backtracking in other parts of, the military decision-making?
There is still a possibility of that kind of diplomatic breakthrough. And for the Israelis, the dream scenario would be to see Hamas agree to withdraw from the Gaza Strip and release the hostages. The issue with that is that Hamas right now has a political incentive to try to drive a wedge between Israel and particularly its American allies by extending the misery within the Gaza Strip. And that means not cutting a deal at the moment. But as Israel carries out some of these shaping operations in Rafa, where they're assassinating top leaders of Hamas, and they're carrying out these limited raids, Hamas's leadership may get to a point where they say they will have to come to some sort of deal, some sort of accommodation that could finally bring about a ceasefire.
What are people in Israel saying about the hostages right now?
Well, it's very divided still, but I think increasingly the public sentiment is that Israel needs to do more to secure those hostages rather than what we would have seen in the earlier phases of the war, where there was something of a split public opinion in which the hostages' lives always mattered and were always important, but the military campaign took precedence over that. I think at this point, most Israelis want to see those hostages released and returned home, even if that might mean giving a temporary pause to Hamas, and even if that might mean that Israel is unable to complete its military objectives of dismantling Hamas in the near term.